How am I supposed to handle this now?
We will handle it together. Give me the phone.
Pastor, this delay is unacceptable. The community demands answers now.
You question my authority in this house of God. You will respect the process, young man.
You are hereby under arrest.
This is scandalous. I can't believe this is happening.
Move along, Pastor.
He promised me help, but he used my desperation.
Order. This court finds the defendant guilty on all counts.
Look at her. I can't believe she's finally here. You did so well, my love.
Nola's hands trembled as she sat alone in the quiet living room of their modest home in Lagos, staring at the glowing screen of her phone as if it carried the weight of her entire future. The ceiling fan rotated slowly above her, pushing warm evening air across her tear-streaked face while her heart pounded like a drum announcing disaster. And when she finally heard the familiar sound of her husband's car pulling into the compound, her breath caught in her throat because she knew there would be no turning back from what she was about to do. She rose from the chair the moment he stepped inside, his face bright with excitement, still glowing from the joy of believing he was about to become a father. But before he could speak, she sank to her knees on the tiled floor, her body shaking with guilt, whispering, "My husband, I have done something terrible," and the smile slowly faded from his face as confusion replaced joy, for he had expected celebration, not submission. He hurried toward her, trying to lift her up, telling her she had done nothing wrong, reminding her how happy he was about the pregnancy, but she refused to stand, tears spilling uncontrollably as she confessed that the baby she carried might not be his. That in her desperation to conceive after years of being mocked for barrenness, she had sought help from a pastor who claimed he could spiritually bless her womb, a man she had trusted as a servant of God but who had manipulated her vulnerability, convincing her that intimacy was part of a divine process, and in her broken state she believed him. Her husband staggered back as though struck, whispering, "You must be joking," yet her silence answered him louder than words, and with trembling fingers she showed him the recorded videos the pastor had secretly made, explaining how the man was now demanding 5 million naira to keep quiet, threatening to send the recordings to him and post them online. The room felt smaller with every second, heavy with betrayal and heartbreak, yet instead of shouting, instead of rage, her husband did something unexpected. He steadied himself, swallowed the pain clawing at his chest, and declared that regardless of what had happened, she was still his wife and the child in her womb was his, that no manipulative preacher would steal their joy or define their marriage. Nola stared at him in disbelief as he gently lifted her from the floor and seated her on the couch, his voice calm but firm as he vowed to confront the so-called man of God himself. He even reached into his briefcase and brought out a delicate gold necklace he had bought to celebrate becoming a father, fastening it around her neck with trembling but determined hands, calling her his queen despite everything, telling her not to fear, insisting that love was stronger than shame. And though confusion still clouded her heart, a flicker of hope ignited within her. That night he cooked for her, refusing to let her lift a finger, protecting her from her own guilt as if she were fragile glass. But beneath his calm exterior a storm was forming, because by morning he would drive to the church and confront the pastor who had dared to threaten his family, unaware that this confrontation would ignite a chain of events that would shake not only their marriage but an entire congregation to its foundation. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen over the restless city of Lagos, Nola's husband dressed in silence, his jaw tight with controlled anger as he stepped into his car and drove toward the pastor's church, a large cream-colored building that stood arrogantly at the corner of a busy street as though holiness itself resided within its walls. And when he arrived, the compound was quiet except for a few workers sweeping the dusty ground. He walked straight past them, his footsteps steady and deliberate, and entered the pastor's office without hesitation, where the so-called man of God sat behind a polished wooden desk, pretending to study his Bible. The pastor looked up, surprised, but quickly masking it with a rehearsed smile. Yet that smile faded when Nola's husband introduced himself and calmly explained why he was there, stating that he had seen the videos, that he knew about the threats, and that he would not give a single naira to a man who used scripture as a mask for extortion. The pastor leaned back in his chair, attempting intimidation, claiming he had more recordings and that if 5 million naira was not paid, the clips would flood social media and destroy the marriage. But instead of fear, he met defiance. Nola's husband declared boldly that the child in his wife's womb belonged to him and not to any fraudulent preacher, that no blackmail would separate him from his wife, and that if the pastor ever contacted her again, he would face consequences. Far worse than online exposure, the office air thickened with tension as two men locked eyes, one driven by greed and arrogance, the other by wounded love and unshakable resolve, and for the first time the pastor sensed something different about this husband. He was not the type to beg or panic. Still, the pastor boasted about his popularity, about loyal members who would never believe accusations, about his influence and wealth, claiming no one could touch him because he was a respected spiritual authority, but Nola's husband only shook his head and called him what he truly was, a thief hiding behind religion, and with that he turned and left, not in defeat but in calculation. Back home, Nola anxiously asked what had happened, and he simply told her to trust him, that the man who thought he held power was about to learn a painful lesson. Later that afternoon, he took her phone, copied the pastor's number, and began crafting a plan that required patience rather than fists. Disguising himself with a hidden WhatsApp profile and sending the pastor a respectful message posing as a wealthy new member who had been inspired by his sermons and wanted to join the church permanently, the bait was irresistible. He mentioned an 8 million naira donation. And within minutes the pastor responded enthusiastically, sending a link to the church's large WhatsApp group and his personal account details without suspicion. As soon as he was added, Nola's husband observed the group. Filled with over 1,000 members, daily devotionals, prayer requests, and blind admiration flooding the chat, and he realized this was the stage he needed. His heart pounded as he began typing, aware that with one press of a button he could shatter the illusion that protected the pastor. He introduced himself as a new member but then dropped the truth like a thunderbolt, accusing the pastor of sleeping with his wife, of secretly recording intimate acts, of demanding 5 million naira to keep silent, and before anyone could react, he uploaded edited clips that clearly showed the pastor's face while carefully protecting Nola's identity. Within seconds the group exploded with shocked messages, disbelief, anger, and confusion, but he did not stop there. He declared that he refused to pay blackmail and warned everyone to stay away from a church built on deception. Then he exited the group before he could be removed, his pulse racing as silence filled the room around him. Nola stared at him wide-eyed, unsure whether to feel terrified or relieved, while he simply exhaled deeply, whispering that the man who had threatened their peace would now face his own storm, unaware that by sunrise the videos would spread far beyond a single WhatsApp group, igniting outrage across the entire city and setting into motion consequences that neither the pastor nor the congregation could control. By the following morning, what had begun as a single explosive message inside a church WhatsApp group had erupted into a wildfire across Lagos, as the edited clips exposing the pastor's misconduct leapt from one phone to another, spreading through social media platforms at terrifying speed. And before sunrise his once polished image as a respected spiritual leader had begun to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. In his bedroom, unaware of the storm gathering beyond his walls, the pastor slept comfortably until his phone rang repeatedly, and when he finally answered his secretary's frantic call, irritation quickly transformed into horror as he was told that explicit videos featuring him were trending online, that people were mocking him, calling him a fake prophet, a predator, a disgrace to the pulpit. At first he laughed nervously, assuming it was exaggeration, but when he opened his phone and saw his own face circulating across countless posts, his stomach dropped and his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. Panic replaced arrogance as he realized that the anonymous new member could only have been Nola's husband, the one man who had refused to be intimidated, and in that instant he understood that he had underestimated the wrong person. Desperately, he rushed to his church, hoping to control the narrative before Sunday's service, convincing himself that loyal members would dismiss the scandal as manipulation or artificial intelligence fabrication. Yet as he arrived, he noticed unusual silence in the compound and whispers among the few early arrivals, their eyes avoiding his. When he mounted the pulpit, microphone in hand, the once crowded sanctuary looked disturbingly empty, rows of plastic chairs unoccupied, musicians absent, ushers standing stiffly at the back, and instead of applause, he heard murmurs. He attempted to preach, claiming the videos were doctored lies orchestrated by enemies of progress, but the truth was too visible, too undeniable, and the confidence in his voice cracked under pressure. While he struggled to salvage his authority, Nola's husband was already at the local police station, calmly presenting evidence of blackmail, threats, and unauthorized recordings, and once officers reviewed the materials, they acted swiftly. In the middle of the pastor's desperate sermon, uniformed police officers entered the sanctuary, their boots echoing against the tiled floor, and the congregation fell silent as they approached the altar and informed him of his arrest for extortion, abuse of spiritual authority, and criminal intimidation. Humiliation burned across his face as cold metal handcuffs snapped around his wrists, the same hands that once waved dramatically while prophesying. And cameras from curious onlookers captured the moment, ensuring that the spectacle would spread even faster online. As he was escorted out, some members shook their heads in disgust while others watched in stunned disbelief. Realizing that the man they trusted with their secrets had betrayed that trust for greed and lust, at the station, the pastor attempted to bribe the officers, offering millions to make the case disappear, but his money no longer carried weight in a situation where evidence spoke louder than influence, and he was thrown into a dim detention cell where the reality of his actions finally settled upon him like a suffocating blanket. Alone on the hard bench, stripped of his expensive robes and public admiration, he replayed his choices in his mind: the manipulation of vulnerable women, the secret recordings, the threats, and for the first time, fear replaced pride. Meanwhile, Nola remained at home, trembling at the thought of public exposure yet protected by her husband's careful editing, her identity still shielded while the pastor's reputation collapsed entirely. By nightfall, journalists had begun reporting the arrest, headlines questioning how many other victims might exist, and former church members started sharing testimonies of suspicious encounters, revealing that Nola was not the first woman lured under the guise of spiritual counseling. What had once been a thriving congregation was now a scene of chaos and disillusionment. And as the pastor lay awake in detention listening to distant sounds of the station, he realized that the authority he had claimed to possess was nothing but a fragile illusion, shattered by one husband who chose courage over fear and truth over silence. The arrest of the disgraced pastor sent shockwaves far beyond the church walls, and within days the case became one of the most talked about scandals in the city, drawing journalists, bloggers, and curious onlookers to the courthouse each time proceedings were scheduled. While Nola struggled quietly with the emotional weight of knowing that her private pain had become public conversation, when the pastor was formally arraigned before the judge, the courtroom was packed to capacity, wooden benches filled with murmuring spectators eager to witness the downfall of a man who had once commanded spiritual authority. And as he stood in the dock dressed in a simple outfit rather than his usual flowing white robe, the contrast between his former glory and present humiliation was painfully clear. The prosecutor read out the charges in a steady voice: criminal intimidation, blackmail, non-consensual recording of intimate acts, abuse of religious influence, and each word seemed to echo loudly through the room, stripping away the final fragments of the pastor's dignity. Yet when asked how he pleaded, he responded, "Not guilty," clinging to denial like a drowning man grasping at floating debris. His lawyer argued that the videos could have been manipulated, suggesting a setup orchestrated by jealous enemies, but the evidence presented by the police, including original metadata and messages demanding 5 million naira, painted a far darker and undeniable truth. When Nola was called to testify, the courtroom grew still, and though her voice trembled at first, she gathered courage as she described the emotional vulnerability she experienced after years of infertility, how cultural pressure and whispered mockery from relatives had driven her into desperation, and how the pastor exploited that pain by convincing her that intimacy was divinely ordained as part of a spiritual cleansing to unlock her womb, a manipulation that blurred faith with deception. She admitted her mistake openly, tears falling freely, yet emphasized that she never consented to being recorded or threatened, and that once she realized the truth, fear consumed her life. Her husband's testimony followed, calm and unwavering, recounting how he discovered the blackmail, confronted the pastor, and ultimately chose to expose the crime rather than surrender to extortion, explaining that his actions were not revenge but protection for his wife, his marriage, and potentially other women who might have been targeted. The courtroom atmosphere shifted from curiosity to indignation as the video clips were played before the judge, carefully edited to preserve Nola's identity while clearly revealing the pastor's face and actions. And even those who had once defended him could no longer maintain their belief in his innocence. Over several weeks the trial continued, witnesses stepping forward, including former female congregants who hinted at similar inappropriate counseling sessions, strengthening the prosecution's case and dismantling the image of holiness the pastor had cultivated for years. Outside the courthouse, news outlets debated the broader issue of fraudulent spiritual leaders exploiting trust, and social media conversations ignited about accountability within religious institutions. Finally, after exhaustive arguments, the day of judgment arrived, and the courtroom once again filled with anxious anticipation as the judge delivered the verdict in a firm, unwavering tone, finding the pastor guilty on all major charges and sentencing him to 12 years in prison without the option of a fine, declaring that positions of spiritual leadership carry greater responsibility and that betrayal of such trust warrants serious consequence. Gasps rippled through the room as the pastor's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions settling fully upon him, while Nola exhaled deeply for what felt like the first time in months, her husband squeezing her hand reassuringly as justice replaced fear. Government officials soon sealed the church building pending further investigation, its once busy sanctuary reduced to silence, and as the pastor was led away to begin his sentence, the message was clear: no title, robe, or popularity could shield a person from accountability when truth finally stands in the light. The Sunday after the guilty verdict felt strangely quiet across the neighborhood where the once thriving church stood, its tall gates half closed and its signboard still bearing the bold name that had once attracted hundreds, yet now the compound echoed only with wind and scattered leaves, and inside the sanctuary rows of empty plastic chairs faced a silent altar like witnesses to a fallen empire. Before government officials officially sealed the building, the pastor, now out on temporary bail, during appeal procedures, insisted on visiting one last time with his wife and 3 children, perhaps clinging to a fragile hope that a handful of loyal members might appear in solidarity. But as he stepped through the familiar doors wearing his white robe that once symbolized authority, the emptiness greeted him more loudly than any accusation ever could. He walked slowly toward the pulpit, each footstep heavy with regret, remembering the days when applause followed his sermons and offerings filled the baskets, when people knelt before him asking for blessings, unaware that the very platform he used to preach righteousness had become the stage of his undoing. His wife stood quietly near the front row, her face marked by confusion and silent humiliation, unsure whether to comfort him or confront him, while their children whispered among themselves, too young to fully understand why classmates had begun mocking them and why their father's name now trended for shame rather than honor. He picked up the microphone, but his voice failed him, and instead of delivering a sermon, he sank to his knees at the altar, pressing his forehead against the cold tiles as if seeking forgiveness from a heaven he had misrepresented. Memories flooded his mind, the first time he wore clerical robes, the early days when his preaching carried sincerity, the gradual temptation of money and admiration that blurred his moral boundaries, and finally the reckless decision to exploit vulnerable women. Under the disguise of spiritual guidance, outside, passers-by slowed to glance at the building, some shaking their heads in disappointment, others whispering that justice had been served. And within hours government officials arrived with documents authorizing the closure of the premises pending asset investigation, placing seals on the doors and inventorying equipment purchased with donations. Across town, Nola and her husband watched the developments from a distance, choosing not to celebrate, but to reflect quietly on how close they had come to losing everything. For although justice had prevailed, the emotional scars of betrayal and public exposure still lingered. Nola's pregnancy had advanced significantly, her movements slower now, her mind often drifting to questions about the child she carried and whether doubt would ever completely disappear from her heart. Yet her husband remained steadfast, attending every medical appointment, cooking meals when she felt exhausted, and reminding her daily that forgiveness was not weakness but strength. As news programs analyzed the scandal, discussions arose about accountability within religious institutions and the responsibility of congregants to question blind devotion. While former church members formed small prayer groups in their homes, seeking faith without manipulation, the sealed sanctuary stood as a physical reminder that power built on deception cannot endure. And for the pastor, who now awaited the full enforcement of his sentence, the silence of that empty hall was more deafening than prison bars, because it represented the collapse of trust, influence, and identity all at once. Meanwhile, in their modest home, Nola and her husband prepared for the arrival of their child, determined that from the ruins of scandal they would construct something stronger, a marriage tempered by trial and a future defined not by shame but by resilience. 9 long months after the scandal first erupted, after court appearances, whispered gossip, online debates, and the final sentencing that sent the disgraced pastor to prison for 12 years, Nola found herself lying in a hospital bed on a quiet evening, gripping the rails as waves of labor pain surged through her body, and in that sterile white room where machines beeped steadily and nurses moved with urgent calmness, the past seemed to collide with the present. Throughout her pregnancy she had carried not only a child but also fear that the baby might resemble the pastor, fear that doubt might poison her marriage forever, fear that despite her husband's unwavering assurance, biology might reveal a truth she dreaded. But through every anxious moment, Her husband had stood beside her like a shield, reminding her that whatever the outcome, they would face it together. Now, as contractions intensified, he held her hand tightly, whispering encouragement and prayers, his own heart pounding with anticipation and nervous hope, until finally, after hours that felt like eternity, the cry of a newborn pierced the air, sharp and beautiful, and the nurse lifted a baby girl into the light. Time seemed to pause as both parents searched the child's tiny face, and almost immediately Nola's breath caught, not in fear, but in astonished relief, because the baby had her husband's exact nose, his curved ears, even the shape of his eyes. Tears streamed down her cheeks as the infant was placed gently in her arms, and her husband laughed and cried at the same time, overwhelmed by gratitude. Yet despite the visible resemblance, they both agreed to take a DNA test to erase every remaining shadow of doubt once and for all, unwilling to allow suspicion to linger in the corners of their renewed peace. Days later, when the results confirmed that the child was indeed her husband's biological daughter, Nola broke down completely, the burden she had carried for months dissolving into uncontrollable sobs of relief, and her husband embraced her, whispering, "I told you our joy would not be stolen," his voice steady and filled with triumph not over another man, but over despair itself. They named their daughter Timya, meaning "Ye God's will is sufficient," a declaration that their story had not ended in disgrace but in restoration. Soon after, they made the decision to relocate to a different town, seeking distance from the memories and gossip that once haunted them, and in their new beginning her husband secured a better job while helping Nola establish a small boutique business, giving her purpose beyond the painful chapter she had survived. Gradually, laughter returned to their home, replacing nights once filled with silent tears, and the woman who had once knelt trembling on a living room floor believing she had destroyed her marriage now held her daughter confidently, stronger and wiser. Though the scars of betrayal remained as reminders, they no longer defined her identity, and the man who chose forgiveness over fury became the quiet hero of their story, proving that love anchored in commitment can withstand storms that seem impossible to survive. Far away, inside prison walls, the former pastor faced the consequences of his choices, his once famous name fading into obscurity, while the family he tried to shatter moved forward into light. And so, from humiliation rose courage, from deception emerged truth, and from broken trust blossomed a deeper bond, as Nola and her husband rebuilt their lives one day at a time, no longer prisoners of fear but living testimonies that even in the darkest moments, redemption remains possible for those who choose honesty, accountability, and unwavering love.